Good morning all and welcome to this week's Jump Recruitment discussion. And this week we're tackling the big one head on. It's probably the most commonly asked question we get from our client base, and there's some of the questions that we get from outside of that. This week we're talking about KPIs, new school techniques versus old school accountability, how to adapt KPI-driven operations in today's recruitment world. And I've had some real fun this morning sort of digging out some facts. The Daily Sales, who's a big company that sort of does lots of market research on sales in the UK, say most people don't know how to use LinkedIn properly because they are too quick to sell or fail to engage with their connections. And yet most recruiters spend most of their time on LinkedIn. People are busier than ever, and getting a reply from an email is hard. 80% of all emails are read on smartphones. So we've got to start to think, we've got to keep it short and brief. And one thing they did say is if you put a PS at the end of an email, it increases your reply rate by around about 70%. So it's something worth trying if you haven't done that. The big thing they brought out though was 62% of all salespeople stroke account managers and 75% of all business owners will fail to hit their targets, which is quite a big comment. According to HubSpot, just 17% of salespeople think they are pushy, compared to 50% of the prospects that they're selling to who think they are pushy. Along similar lines, only 3% of buyers trust their salespeople, and the only professions with less credibility within recruiters were car salespeople, politics, and lobbying. So there you go. On average, it takes 18 calls to actually connect to a buyer. Only 24% of all emails are opened. 60% of customers say no 4 times before saying yes, whereas 48% of salespeople never make a single follow-up attempt after that initial call. 42% of people will be encouraged to make a purchase if the sales rep calls back at an agreed and specific time. Using collaborative words had a positive impact on a sale. So using words like we instead of I can increase the success rate by 35%. Salespeople spend less than 1/3 of their day actually talking to prospects. They spend 21% of their day writing emails, 17% entering data, another 17% prospecting and doing lead research, 12% going to internal meetings, 12% scheduling calls, and a vast amount of time making tea and coffee. 92% of consumers trust referrals from people they know, but only 47% of the top performers ask for referrals consistently versus 26% of non-top performers. I could have gone on. There's loads and loads of data out there written about that. So the crutch is what drives performance. Okay, what does drive performance? And how often do we as a business truly look at the stats and address our KPIs so they actually become meaningful? So today I'm joined by a full complement. Paul, Dave and Heather are here today, which is really great. So let's keep things short and brief because we've got an awful lot to answer. Dave, one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot is that our clients ask a massive amount about targets. So the question is, KPIs, are they important in the new era of recruitment or not?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. It depends what we regard as the new era of recruitment. I think one thing that we've all learned and we will continue to follow on is that our approach to the market has to be as good as it was 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago even, because it's about personality, it's about chemistry, it's about character, it's about culture. You can still measure all of those things, but that's what the new era of recruitment for me is. And to me, that's not new. That's us doing the job the way we should be doing the job and being measured the way we should be measured. So new era of recruitment is just being really, really good at what we do on behalf of our candidates and clients. And do they matter? Well, of course they matter, because as you've just said, using those stats, Howard, there is so much going on for all of our employees, both in the office, working from home, and in the wider world with what's going on, that often employees can lose sight of what's important. And KPIs can help employees understand what's important. And I guess we'll come on to that as we go on.
Paul, you've always got something to say on this matter, normally.
Yep. Well, you know me. I can't compete with you, Stato. Not today, that's for sure. I think that, in terms of what Dave says, what's new? We've always measured our output, as it were, through input. So what we're doing to create the fees has always been important to measure and monitor. And I've always managed recruitment businesses using a basic set of metrics. The metrics, I think, are changing. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, a bit later on. However, some of the very old-fashioned metrics that we've always used, i.e. ratios, vacancies to placements, interviews to placements, as just two examples, are still as relevant today as they ever were, even back in my early days. So I think it's still important, but I think, to Dave's point, in the modern era, there are so many other things that we need to be looking at in terms of the whole area of EVP, the way in which we wish to, as a business, be seen by our clients and our candidates, the behaviours and values that we wish to exhibit and that we should be monitoring, and indeed in some senses rewarding. So I think that the KPIs are still very important in our industry. I can't conceive of managing a recruitment business without having a collective set of metrics that everybody buys into, that we measure on a daily, weekly, monthly basis and so forth. But I think they're broader now than they've ever been, and I think perhaps more intelligent than they've ever been. We're looking for behaviours and values perhaps that 10, 20, 30 years ago we would not have been talking about.
Heather, it'd be interesting from a HR point of view, really what, because obviously you will come across this all the time when sort of addressing people who are either coming into the business, leaving the business, etc. KPIs, give us your view of KPIs.
I agree with what Paul and Dave have both said. They are important. They absolutely have a place in recruitment. They always have, and I think they always will, because we get the things we measure, and that's a truism that that continues. But I do think that recruitment is changing, and I think what our clients value, and the relationship-driven nature of recruitment and the kind of consulting part of recruitment consultant is increasingly more important as our industry evolves, and so therefore our KPIs have to evolve. And I think we can sometimes be in danger of just keep on measuring the things we've always measured, when in fact the things that move our business forward are not perhaps what they were traditionally.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that, and I think I've got a foot in both camps here. So yes and no. Yes, KPIs, but I think KPIs need to be fully understood, and we need to be measuring outcomes that actually lead to a deal rather than just measuring vanity in some ways. So I think the bigger question is who and when do we set KPIs for? And to me, if you're bringing new people into the business, should we not be setting the correct principles for them across the business and ensure the intention of the activity will actually create the results they need? So I think setting the right principles when people start and getting those principles running through the core of your business creates uniformity, collaboration, and joint accountability. So for me, everyone is in charge of their piece of the jigsaw, and so the intention is to what do we get our consultants to achieve, and that goes back to what we do measure, if we measure at all. And I think it's a really interesting question about measuring. So if we looked at that, if we were to measure activity, what would you measure and why?
Who's going first?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think for me, I would only measure what matters. And it depends on your recruitment business. It depends on how you run it, the way you run it. Most of us will have some sort of software that will measure everything. CVs to interview, interviews to calls, all of the usual ratios that we know so well. Most companies have something that does that for them, whether they like it or not. Whether they choose to use it is up to them. But a few of the things, I think, to the earlier point, that matter are things like time spent with candidates, either on Zoom or in person, number of people you've built in your network that week, the number of referrals. You used an excellent stat earlier about referrals, the number of referrals you've got, the number of times you make a callback when you say you would. Those sort of things are maybe a little bit more difficult to measure because they're not the standard KPIs, But in a world where there is a talent shortage, the things that really matter are the things that will differentiate you from your competition. And whilst they may all be measuring the usual things that everybody measures, if you can measure something else, it can give you an absolute laser focus on where your business is. And you may find out that someone you think is not performing as well, and maybe they are, they're just doing things that take a little bit longer.
I think it's interesting there, some of the things that you brought out there, Dave, with regards to candidates, etc. And I want to sort of, I'll caveat that at the end. So, again, if you looked at that, Paul, what would you measure and why?
Okay, well, I actually think this is a very big question, because I think what you've got to do is start at the end, in a sense. What is it that you are trying to achieve as a business? So if you believe, as an example, that it's about being very highly consultative to build trusted advisor positioning. If you look at things like the Boston Matrix, for example, and you're looking to establish that Pareto's law issue of really leveraging your relationships with around 30% of your client base to get 70% of new business, as an example, then client meetings clearly are going to be important. So in other words, what is it you're trying to achieve? What do you want your business to represent? Having random metrics is really going to get you nowhere. They have to have some level of design attached to them. What kind of image are you trying to portray as an organization? To Dave's point, if you are a business that wants to be seen as offering the very best candidate care, what metrics are going to align with that in order to achieve it? And to your point, Howard, it needs to be uniformed across the business. So it begins, I think, when you're looking at metrics, what is it we want to be as a business? How do we wish to stand out from our competitors? What do we want to represent by way of consultative services, if you like, with clients, and then work backwards from that position? If, on the other hand, and this isn't said in a derogatory fashion, your business is all about just chucking CVs, trying to establish as many, firing, if you like, bullets in random directions to hit a few targets, then fine. I mean, if that's the way you conduct your business, that's not the way I would, by the way, but if it is, then I think the standard measures that we've always had in our industry would probably suffice. But I think these days it's a deeper question. So if you are a business that wants social media presence and you want to make sure that you have a standout presence on LinkedIn or Facebook or any of the other TikTok or any other social media platforms, then surely then your criteria will be about the amount of blogs or posts you're putting out per individual or for the business, or indeed the volume of contacts or followers that you're obtaining. So I think it starts really with strategy. What is your strategic aim? How do you wish to achieve it, and work backwards from that point in terms of measuring activity?
Heather?
Yeah, don't disagree with those perspectives. I think one of the things that I don't see enough recruiters doing, but I would like to see more, I've seen it increasing slightly, but I still don't think we do it enough, is actually to be asking our clients and our customers what their interaction's been like with us. So I think we're missing a trick in terms of measuring service and satisfaction. And I think, that whole adage of a complaint is a gift, we should be providing way more opportunities for our candidates and our clients to feed back to us on how well we're doing. And I think that's a huge measure that we should put in place and make, we tend to want to kind of hide that stuff. And actually, I think it would be great for us as an industry to be much more open to that feedback and measure that.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that service and quality is something that you've all sort of mentioned to a certain degree. And what we're talking about constantly is service and quality. And it's interesting, your inference there, Heather, was to the client. And yet I've got that drive, and I've been saying this for quite some time now, that we focus on the client constantly and forget the candidate. And yet we can't make a placement without the candidate. And if you start to think about how KPIs evolve and what we do with that, we don't really evolve our candidate KPIs as half as much as we involve our clients. And so if you start to think about what every client measures, what's your pipeline like? What's your requirement pipeline like? And we're always talking about the requirement pipeline. So if you said you've got 10 requirements, and let's say it's 5K ahead, that's a 50K. We land 25% of that pipeline. That's 12.5K. However, in the UK, the norm is we send 3 CVs to each individual job. So our candidate pipeline is 150K. So even if we landed 10% of that pipeline, you're still bigger than your pipeline from your client. But if you landed 25% of your candidate pipeline, that's 37.5K. So what are we measuring? And that actually goes back to that first question. Are we measuring the right things that actually lead to a placement? And we seem to be very focused on the client. So my view would be I'd be focusing more on what we're measuring from a candidate's point of view and measuring what we do from a service point of view to get the candidates through that recruitment process. And so that goes back to what Dave's saying with regards to, how many candidates do you register? How many new candidates do you bring into your marketplace? How many candidates have you got out with multiple clients? So are you giving your candidates choice of where they're going? Because again, I was with a client yesterday and they were still very much fixated. One candidate goes to one client, and yet they're saying, but we've got a massive problem now with candidates getting counter offered and offered by other people because you're not offering them the service. We're just offering them one opportunity.
Yeah,
so to me,
I think you're right, Howard. I think we probably, certainly we could, and I bet most of the people who are listening to us could predict what their clients would say if they asked for feedback. I think we'd be horrified by what some of our candidates might say about us. And so I do think we should be listening more to what our candidates are saying for 2 reasons. One, the one you're saying, actually they have real value to us, but also because I don't think we hear those messages, and I don't think we focus enough on the candidate journey as an industry.
Well, let me just add to that. And I think you make great points here. We can spend a lot of time sitting in rooms trying to be innovative and come up with new ideas that we think are going to be outstanding and will make a big difference for our clients and candidates. But it's very rare, I find, for recruitment businesses to actually actively be talking directly to clients and candidates on a regular basis. And I would add, I think that, to your point, perfectly brilliant point, Heather, we should be talking to people. What do they want and what do they feel about the services we're providing? Where are the gaps? And interestingly, how much time do directors, senior leadership teams spend on a weekly, quarterly basis talking directly to clients, candidates? Do they follow up after we make placements? Do they make calls to find out what they felt about the service, the clients, the candidates? What about the clients that we didn't help? Because you'll probably, to your earlier point, get better feedback from the clients that we didn't help than the ones we helped. What about the candidates that we failed to assist? And who is making those calls? Well, I would suggest that clearly it works across all businesses and everybody has a responsibility. But I genuinely think that senior leaders should be making these calls, not to everybody, we're not asking that, but random calls, random samples on a weekly basis to establish the feedback from clients and candidates. What a gift that is to be able to establish where you can improve the quality of your service and gain an edge over your competitors.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we talk about that and we talk about candidates in that way, and yet we still don't drive into that candidate marketplace half as much as we should do because we're too fixated on our client. But if we took product to our clients, then our service is a secondary sell. But we take our service to our clients and try to sell our service without actually understanding what product they need. And I think there's a real big differentiator there, what we're doing with that and how we work with that. And I remember point blankly as a young recruiter and my boss shouting, is that going to be candidate wonder, or is it going to be candidate blunder? And what he meant was, you've got 3 candidates across, you're going to get one a placement, but instantly what's put into your mind is the other 2 are rubbish, they're blunders, they're rubbish. But yet we could place one of those in another client, you're going to double the amount of placements that you make, but we're not giving our candidates enough opportunity, and therefore candidates aren't loyal to us, hence they're going everywhere and to everybody. So we've got to start to think about the bigger part of the marketplace, because there are more candidates than there are clients. So why aren't we focusing on that? And I just don't quite understand that sometimes, but yeah, that's maybe a change that we can look at. So if we look at targets, there's been lots written about targets. So the question is about to target or not to target. So where do you guys stand on, should we actually target our performers or not?
I think we should. I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't target our performers, partly so that they know where they're going, they know what the steps are on the way. and as business owners, we get a view of how they're performing in the business. I think it's, as Paul said earlier, it starts from the top. Whatever your direction is, whatever your journey is and where you want to end up, you need to know how your individuals are getting on against that. So I would target, you know, my famous saying, Howard, let the data decide. Well,
Yeah.
you've got to have the data. Because then also you need the conversation, you need that data to support the conversation. You may have a feeling that someone's doing well or a feeling that someone's doing poorly, but if you've got targets in whatever shape they are, then they can be used. And if you have too many targets, that's the one thing I would say, is don't have too many targets. Because if you're measuring everything, then all you have are indicators. And what you need is something that's, you know, maybe the top 2 or 3 things that they're going to know that they've got to develop and build.
I think that's
whatever.
Yeah, that's really valid, Dave, that thing about over targeting people. So sometimes I think we do that, you know, that whole blitz of these are all the things, and actually really thoughtful, individualized targeting, especially with experienced, successful recruiters. You know, otherwise they can be counterproductive. And I was doing some development with somebody who's recently moved into a billing manager role, so his first managerial role, and he's still been targeted on his desk, and his targets are actually debilitating because they're stopping him from developing the skills that he needs to develop managing his team. And so actually I think his targets are working against him, and I think that can be the risk if we're not very thoughtful about how we target people.
So I want you to hold that thought there, Heather, because we're going to have a webinar in the next 4 series of webinars on that very topic, because I think that's a huge topic about, you know, stepping from one position to another position, and that stepping from a top biller into a billing manager is the hardest position in recruitment. So we will come back to that. Paul?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, the answer is yes, we should have targets. And I would argue, what self-respecting business fails to have targets? If you are a public limited company, you have to be in a position to predict your profits, your turnover and so forth. Your share prices rest on all of that. Every business, regardless of whether it's recruitment or in any other industry, have targets. That comes with the territory. And we work in a sales industry. I know that's the S word is something that apparently we're not allowed to talk about any longer. But the truth is that when you sign up to work for a recruitment business, you are signing up to sell. And therefore, if you're working in a sales environment, you're unquestionably going to have targets. But I take the point on board from what the guys have just said, and I completely agree. I think, you know, the old KISS principle, everybody knows what that stands for, is very important here. Let's make sure that we don't overburden people with too many targets, because if you feel overwhelmed by targets, and in fact, if you give people too many, they're bound to fail against some of them. It's just demoralizing. So keep it simple. Make sure that the targets that are being set are easy to understand, and give people a reason as to why we're asking them to work towards those targets, so they understand what's in it for them, not just what's in it for the business. That comes back to things like the old-fashioned ratios, because I remember as a youngster thinking, well, how come I have weeks where I do extremely well and other weeks when I don't? What's going on here? And just literally sitting down each day and making a note of how many calls I was making, or interviews I was arranging, or vacancies I was taking. And then at the end of the week, the month, the quarter, and so forth, I'd work out my conversion ratios, and then I worked like Billio to ensure that each week and month I hit those numbers. And guess what? I had consistent success. And I think those principles still pervade even today, even though, as we said earlier, there are, I think, targets today, quite rightly, that are refreshing and reflect what we as an industry, and indeed as individual businesses, wish to demonstrate to the public when we're working with clients and candidates. But I absolutely see this as essential. Just keep it pretty simple, don't overcomplicate it, but you can't manage a business without measuring targets.
So it's interesting, and I challenged all of that, not for the sake of just challenging it, just because I think we need to have a different perspective sometimes. At the beginning of this webinar, we talked about sometimes we don't change things because we just don't, you know, review things and look at that. And it's interesting, Dave, you said let the data decide. We talked about KPIs, and to me that KPI is the I that's the most important thing. It's just an indication of what people might do. It's not a guarantee, and everyone's going to have selective. And what your comment there, Paul, was that every self-respecting business has a target. However, let the data decide. 62% of salespeople and 75% of sales managers miss their target. So there's a huge sign saying, is our targets working? And so those people who are hit target, usually what you find is in any salespeople organization, doesn't matter. The people who generally hit target, you wouldn't have to target them, and they'll still try and outperform those targets, whatever they are, whatever they get. So they're still going to try and drive that target all the time from there. So do we need to set targets, or do we go back to that principles and intention? And maybe if we recruit the people who are right to drive service, which is what we talked about earlier on, and excellence rather than generating money, would our principles and intention then create a better performing business? Apple principles are to bring a better user experience to customers through innovation, hardware, software, and services. They have no sales target. Apple have zero sales target on their shop floors anywhere. And yet they're the biggest performing business in the world. So
Howard,
what are we missing from that?
Yeah. Howard, I would add, though, they have blisteringly good marketing. And, the products, they've always had the most innovative marketing, amazing marketing, backed up by, as you've already said, outstanding customer service. I mean, they have the recipe for success, as we know.
And they go, so they have the recipe for success, but why aren't other people following that recipe? We know that their products, the actual technology of their products, is way behind quite a lot of other products out there. And therefore, it's all about the service that they're giving. And it's all about the quality of that service that they're giving back to their customers. And that's where their innovation, they purely look at their customers. They don't think about targets. They don't think about sales. And maybe we're missing a trick there. And as I say, I'm just going to throw it out there because I think it's thought-provoking. It's something to create a thought process. If we're talking about changing targets or not to target, etc., that's a great thought process. Is the biggest company in the world does not set sales targets.
Yeah, and I love that idea. I love that provocativeness of the statement, Howard, because it's an antithesis to recruiters, isn't it? That perhaps we should throw away. That perhaps having KPIs in the way we do with, outbound call times, all that kind of stuff. Actually, what we're doing is trying to manage to the lowest common denominator. And what we're trying to do is create an idiot's guide to success. And actually, if we focus on our purpose and our vision, and we hire people who are trained well and inspired, they will drive themselves and they don't need us to impose external KPI. That's a lovely controversial statement. We could debate for hours.
Yeah, I know. And people like Annette and James and people like that coming on the chat and talking quite a lot. Targets drive people's ability to perform. It creates kudos, etc. Talking customer service experience. Do we think net promoter? Yes, all of these things are relevant and all these things are right. What we've got to start to challenge ourselves is, are our KPIs right? And I reckon I could go into most companies and then they've had the same KPIs for the last 20, 30, 40 years because that's the standard recruitment KPI. And that's what we're trying to challenge at the moment. And this conversation about Apple is a thought-provoking. It's not saying, yes, we should change from being a targeted organization, but it shows there is a different way of doing it and people are being very successful at doing it in that way. So
I would give up some of my targets for companies I work with. If when I was launching a new product, I had 150 people outside my office at 8:50 waiting to knock on the door to see what it is that they were.
Yeah, but that's all about service and intrigue, though, isn't it?
I don't have that marketing budget and I don't have that ability. So I want my people to know what they've got to do and I want to measure them.
So here's a question then, Dave. If you had an office full of candidates, and you let every client know you had an office full of candidates that they could purchase, at this moment in time, would you have 150 clients stood outside your door trying to grab those candidates?
At this moment in time, depending on the sector, I bet you I would. Because when And when you said had a little while ago that most people have got 3 candidates to submit to a client, I was sitting there thinking I'm working with a number of clients who would love to have 3 candidates. Yeah, they've got 1 candidate and they're not sure about that candidate because it's such a short demand is so high at the moment.
So let's move on, because the question here that we'll try help sort of Annette with some of her questions and work from there. From a motivational point of view, how do you motivate a team to go beyond their targets?
Well, I think the target, Howard, for me, has got to be in context of where the business is going. So if you are sitting at a desk banging out X number of calls or trying to network X number, but you don't really know why you're doing it other to make money for your desk or to make money for your company, that is not very motivational. In fact, that's somewhat dull. Yeah, and we've got a lot of younger people coming into our industry and they don't behave in that way. That's not what motivates them. So what motivates people is knowing how they fit into the culture and the purpose of the company. And if the targets relate in some way to that, and they are exceeding their targets, they'll be motivated. And if they're not exceeding their targets, but they believe in the business, they'll be motivated even more because they'll want to see business success. So as long as the context of the targets is, this is the journey we're going on, this is how we're going to get there, this is your part in it, and the targets can be explained in that way, I think they're very, very motivational. Where they're less motivational is where salespeople operate in a vacuum and have no idea really what they're doing and why they're doing it and who they're doing it for.
Some interesting points coming in. Yeah, if you look at what Laura Lee say, last year she scaled back her targets to 3 key areas covering output, and would love to add aspects in candidate and client care to our performance. But that surely is all about the values that we provide to our candidates and our clients, and all about our mission that we are driving on. And we go back to that Apple mission statement or principles, is to bring the best user experience to customers through innovation, hardware, software, and service. That's a great line. So we just adapt that to whatever recruitment industry you're in to bring the best user experience to our candidates and to our clients. All of a sudden we have a very different view on what we're measuring, because it's all about the customer experience. Paul, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if I can approach this question almost from a reverse angle, I can. As you and I know how, we used to work for a very large recruitment business that begins with a very large A. And each year I had a new budget given to me by the powers that be that was significantly above what I'd achieved in that year. I'd be way beyond a reasonable level. Keep in mind that my business at that time was pound for pound, prepared to debate this point, of course, the best recruitment company in the country. And I will say that till the day I draw my last breath. But anyway, we were doing very, very, very well indeed. And yet every year I ended up with a target that was given to me that was so beyond what anyone could consider to be reasonable that it was unbelievably demotivating. In fact, I think we all used to see it as bonus suppression tactics.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing worse, I can tell you from experience, starting a year. I mean, I know, of course, I would push back and we would have a debate or an argument, and I'd probably get a little bit of ease on my target, but I would still be left with something that I had real fears about achieving. And that wasn't because I was negative, because anyone that knows me knows that that's the last thing I am. It was me being realistic. And then I had to sell that into my staff, try and figure out how we were going to reach it. But for me personally, it was a terribly demotivational situation. And I think ultimately it was one of the things that kind of started to make me think about, well, do I want to work for these people? Because I was making humongous profits, 5th biggest profit earning unit in the globe. And yet I was put in a place where myself, my colleagues were struggling to earn decent bonuses based upon the targets we were given. So I can give you the opposite. Now, I do think that it's important to make sure that we don't give people targets that are so easy to achieve that there's little point in giving them to them. So, but it's kind of finding that balance, trying to do your research, establishing what the economy is doing, establishing what your clients do. Let's go back to talking to clients again to find out what their plans are for the following 12 months. Looking at candidate flow, the data's everywhere. You've done a great job today, Howard, in demonstrating that. It's everywhere. It's not difficult to do the research. Figure out what the next 12 months is likely to be, or even the next 6 months, and then set targets alongside that. And of course, I would also add, I think it is really about assessing the potential and the experience and abilities of individuals in your business. People often say to me, what should I set as a target for a consultant? Well, we can come up with some basic averages, but this is just an average. What is it? Who is it we're applying this to? How much experience have they got? Where did they come from? How long have they been in the business? What's going on in their markets, their sectors, and so forth? You have to tailor the targets to the individuals or the divisions. So I think that you can easily motivate people brilliantly, I think, with the use of targets, and indeed go beyond those targets and give them every opportunity to do very well for themselves and for the business. But it's very, very easy to demotivate people. And what does that lead to? As I've just placed on the note, attrition, the very thing everybody is desperately worried about at the moment. We cannot afford to lose our best people. We don't want that. We want to attract great new people. So I think this is a very difficult subject that requires a great deal of thought and preparation before you establish what those targets are going to be.
Heather?
Sorry, just left myself on mute there. I agree with what you're saying, but for me, actually, what this comes back to is good management and good individualized targeting. So Joe's just put a really interesting comment in the chat where he's saying that an organization he worked for that we're all familiar with, you had to conduct 15 visits a week and nobody bought into it, and people became demoted and left. That's the real risk for me. It absolutely has to be about individual managers working with individual teams to work out individual targets that will drive them forward in the areas they need to be driven forward, and it's got to be personalized.
I think you're right. I think to me, it was, as a manager, it's how you make people feel.
Yeah.
It's about understanding what motivates them and how you then plug into them as into that motivator. I was never motivated by KPIs. I thought actually KPIs hamstrung my ability, and I made my own KPIs up because I had my own reasons why I wanted to smash my targets, which my boss at the time never understood. She never understood me. And she actually spent more time demotivating me in meetings, talking about KPIs and going, you haven't hit this KPI, you haven't hit that KPI, you haven't that KPI. And I just go, but I'm 125% above target. What do you want me to do? But she couldn't understand it because she was so driven by the KPI and what was hitting on that KPI. And I would just point to the target and go, I'm miles above target. And she'd go, but you're missing all your KPIs. And so, to me, it was when I moved and I found a boss who understood me. And he described me as, I knew what motivated you. I just wound you up, pointed you in the right direction, supported you, and let you go. I got out of your way and let you perform. And when you performed, you were absolutely on it. And I think that, to me, is how you motivate people. So yes, the target is there, and that target should be thing. But most people, it's motivated by how they're made to feel by the people who are actually managing them and developing. And that goes back to your comment there, Paul, about that large company that we all know, because I read exactly the same. It was commission repression from a management point of view, that you're bringing in millions and millions of pounds into a business and you're making no commission, because it wasn't hitting the ridiculous targets that you were set. And that is motivating. But I was still personally motivated to try smash those targets, because that's the type of person I am. And that's the person that, I still am. And so when we sort of pull things, if we measure, we tend to measure lots of things. So very quickly, if you could measure just one thing, that would be an indicator that your business is moving well and performing. What one thing would you measure?
So my one thing, and I would hope that everybody would aspire to this one thing: how happy do you feel working here?
That's a great shout, Dave. That's a great one.
Because the bottom line is that's all that matters. Because if people are happy, they will perform. They will want to perform, they will enjoy performing, and you'll get the best out of them. If you know why they're not happy, you can work on it. If they're really, really unhappy, to Paul's point earlier about retention, they'll leave and then you'll be all perplexed. So decide what it is for your company. What does happiness look like? Is that an 8 out of 10? Right. Can you get to 8 out of 10? And you'll get some people at 9 and some people at 6 and 7s, and work with that. So my one thing, the one only thing that I'd measure is how happy do you feel working here?
Interesting one. Paul, quickly, because I've got one more question I want to ask. We've only got a limited number of time. I've got a big question to finish with, which I want to get out. So very quickly, what one thing would you measure?
Well, I'm very close to Dave's thinking on this. I think it is about, for me, it's about career progression. It's about people developing as professionals, and also on a human scale, developing as people. So for me, it's about retention. I think if you've got high retention rates, you tend to have a successful business. So I would say it's essentially what Dave has said. I tend to agree with that.
Heather?
Yeah, I'll give you one word, Howard, because I know you want to move on. I would measure retention. Retention of candidates, retention of clients, retention of staff.
So it's interesting because we're all saying the same thing, because mine was retention. I first thought, would you measure GP per head? But actually what you're thinking about, the more GP per head would be gained, the more staff that you retain. So it sort of all boils back to the retention of your staff, the development and training of your staff. So the big question I wanted to get to, and I think this is the bit that lots of people maybe want to be interested in. How do you change the carrot and stick culture to become a high-performing sales environment? Because at the moment, that KPI is a very much carrot and stick culture. So how do we change that to become a high-performing environment?
Can I go first this time?
Yes, of course you can. Yeah, go first. Jump in, Heather.
So for me, this is all about culture. And it's all about your vision, your mission, your values, and how well your managers live your mission, vision, values, and how well they're able to hire people who are motivated by those things, and then development and line everything up. So it's how loudly your managers can echo and amplify your vision.
And I wrote the same word down. I wrote culture. I think it's, this phrase carrot and stick is just a horrible expression, isn't it? To get a high performing environment, you want to create the right caring, supportive culture. If people feel valued, if they love working for the business, and you as leaders spend time getting to know them, to support them, to look after them, to provide them more, it's so much more than just giving people high bonus or nice benefits. All of those things are important, and good salaries. All of those things are important. But you cannot win the war on salaries. If you try to be the best paying company, you will find that someone pays more. So it comes down to culture. Creating an environment where people will love working. They love working with the other people. It's not a chore. They cannot wait to get in on a Monday. That's where it's at.
I've never really liked that phrase, carrot or stick. I always used to think the answer is to have a very sharp carrot. Because you need the balance of the two, and the balance is in the culture. And the balance is about leadership. It's about how your managers react. You get that bit right, and then the others follow.
Yeah.
So I did the same thing. I thought, actually, carrot and stick is a horrible comment, but if you remove the stick completely from the situation, then the carrot can maybe become useful. And to me, it was all about developing the right people within your business. And I've just put down, don't underestimate the damage putting the wrong person in the wrong seat does. So we've got to keep changing the incentives, changing the focus, keeping things fresh. So don't let your KPIs become simply the norm, which then everyone starts to ignore or get demotivated by. So if we're using KPIs, then there has to be reward, but also there has to be consequence. So what does that drive? Does that drive motivation, or does that demotivate people? So do we have a blend of team and individual targets? Do we have individual or purely team targets? And as yet, we don't know the answer of what will be the best one. But I think having no targets and having simply the principles and intentions focused on your business performance is the first thing, I think, when we start to create a high-performing business. It's having the right principles, the right intentions of the business, and that will create performance. And that goes back to what you were saying, Heather, that your managers have to scream that constantly. They have to ooze that constantly. And if they do, then that performance comes really, first and foremost. And that's all about service to your clients and to your candidates. And what we've got to understand is that our candidate, there's far more candidates out there than there are clients. And that's the bigger market that we should be servicing, because they actually drive the cash and revenue for our business. So if we put our focus onto our candidates, would we deliver more? So very quickly, how do you measure performance if we don't connect input to output when it comes to targets?
Okay, so I'll kick this off and say, I think it comes down to the 3 C's: client, candidates, and colleagues. So it's back to what Heather said right at the top of this discussion. It's measuring their delight. And I often talk about clients and candidates, and I should say colleagues, being thrilled with service, thrilled with the way they're treated. And I think if you are looking to measure outside of the standard inputs, and we talked about this throughout this discussion, then you must measure how people feel, their emotions towards your business, and their satisfaction with the service you provide. And this isn't just about the people, as I said earlier, that we assist and find jobs for, or the companies we help and find candidates for. This is as much about the people that for whatever reason we were unable to help. Creating world-class service to clients and candidates and taking care of our people is where it's at. That's how you measure it.
I love that word delight, because I use that quite a lot in some of the training sessions that I do with consultants, that you've got to delight your candidates and your clients. If you don't delight them both, then you're starting to lose out. Heather.
Yeah, as Paul said, this is about culture. It's about linking how people feel. It's about having an element of service, and it's got to be individual. So you measure performance based on what it is that motivates individuals and what it is that moves your business forward. There has to be an element of service linking to it, and too many times I think perhaps we reward performance merely in terms of commission and numbers, which is really, really important, and we miss the values piece of it and the cultural contribution piece of it, and especially billing managers, how well they're doing developing the people around them. So some depth, I think, to the measures of performance that aren't purely monetary, without losing sight of the fact that, of course, that's what drives our business.
I always go back, Howard, to one of the best webinars that we did during lockdown was when we had 4 clients on. And the key message I remember from them is, stop talking to us about what you're going to do, ask us what we want. So if we're setting targets and we're measuring performance, what does it look like from the client side? We will all have good client relationships. We could ask the clients how they would like us to measure our people. And that could be a piece of work that a marketing team could do, or whatever, somebody could do. But if you can involve the clients in some way and the candidates in some way, then you'll find out what is a good thing.
So I think that goes back to Paul's comment of start with the end in mind and then work yourself backwards, because what we started, we start with input. How many calls do you make? How many hours on the phone are you making? Which has no actual correlation with output whatsoever. Where if we actually look at what output we want and then go back 1 step or 2 steps, they're the things that you measure and they're the things that you get to. So, I think today's been quite a very interesting conversation. Thank you for all the comments on the chat line. It's always appreciated when you start to get involved, because it says to us that we're hitting the right marks when you guys start to make comments about them and things like that. And I think today was more about challenge the thought process of KPIs. How do we challenge that? What do we need to change to make sure that we do the right things to motivate our people further forward down the line and keep motivating our people and keep retaining our people? And I think that's the biggest, thing that we've talked about today, is that we measure retention and how much that would drive our business forward. Next week, we're going to talk about managers and talk about, how managers perform and what performance we should be getting out of managers. So please join us next week. It'd be much appreciated. Thank you much for your time today. Paul, Dave and Heather, thank you much for your time. And I shall leave it at that. And I shall see you all next week.
Thank you, everybody. Take good care.
Have a good week, everybody.
Bye, everybody.